So I'm here with Steve Andreas, author of many NLP books and one of the early developers. And we're going to talk a bit about the transforming yourself, and the identity model that Steve has created. And without going into too much explanation, I might as well just jump right in and ask you, what made you decide, or what was it that inspired you to go after this project of modeling the identity?
Well, a lot of people have talked for years about identity and how difficult it is to change, and so that was kind of a challenge. One of my earliest intimations of this was written up in Heart of the Mind. A young woman knew she was intelligent, but she didn't know she was lovable, so she needed to be told, minimum of once a day, that she was loved. And that seemed like a little bit too dependent on external events rather than having a real self-concept that would last through time and across context. So I did a fairly simple mapping across and found out how she knew she was intelligent, and then used that as a template to help her feel loved and lovable at the same time. There's another example of this is online on my website, steveandreas.com. Go to articles, and that chapter from the book might be an introduction to people that some people might find interesting. There are two other articles on that website about self-concept. They're also pulled out of the book. They're sort of samples of what's in the book.
So did this start with you having that experience of working with this woman and then thinking, okay, I'm going to actually attempt to model the self-concept, or was it just as you were working at understanding people's issues and problems that it sort of emerged?
Well, actually, I just kind of dropped it for years. I didn't do anything more with it. And then when we learned the swish pattern, after we taught it for a while, we realized that the swish pattern, where you build an image of yourself that no longer has the problem that is troubling the person, that's actually building and or utilizing self-concept. And so that sort of piqued my interest again. I said, oh, well, there's probably more here than I thought. Then I began to explore it a little more systematically. And it wasn't until quite a few years later that I developed everything that's in the book. I taught it for a while and then got bored with it. Anyway, what I did at a certain point is I had some ideas about self-concept, and one of them, I wanted to be durable and last, whether somebody else thought you were good or not. I wanted to have the self-concept be fairly solid and last through time and not be subject to the whims of outrageous fortune. Just recently, I read an article in the Psychotherapy Networker where a woman talks about her self-esteem soaring and crashing within about 5 seconds. And it's kind of an interesting example that I'm writing a whole article about because it has so many things packed into it. But anyway, the example was she was she went horseback riding, and there was a Spanish riding instructor, and he says to her, "You are very beautiful." And so she soared, and she felt wonderful, and she says her self-esteem soared. Well, it wasn't really self-esteem; it was really other esteem, and that's another crucial point that a lot of people don't realize, that self-esteem is not the same as other esteem. And then he finished his sentence with, "Don't ever shave your mustache." And then she crashed. I guess she didn't like the idea of having a mustache. Yeah. And what happened was interesting. It's really interesting because he was meaning it as a compliment. He found her mustache beautiful too, but she didn't think of it as a compliment. And one of the messages here is that if self-esteem clashes with other esteem, self-esteem is the one that will win over, especially when it's negative. She didn't like her mustache. He liked it. So she could have said, "Oh, that's nice. He likes my mustache." She didn't do that. She went to her own self-judgment. Anyway, one of the things I did fairly early was schedule what I call a research seminar, get a bunch of master practitioner trained people who have a lot of experience of the different distinctions in NLP and going inside. And it's a way to do some instant research. So I made it very low cost and invited people that I knew were quite capable. And I had some ideas, but not really. I mean, I had some vague ideas. I had some, let's say, call them prejudices. I had some things to explore, and so we explored them together and developed quite a lot. And then I think I did a second seminar like that where we cleaned things up a little bit more, and then gradually worked further on my own and so on.
That's interesting because one of the things that if people don't know this about you, you come from more of a science background and chemistry, or was it pharmacology?
No, chemistry.
Chemistry, okay.
I've got a bachelor's in chemistry from Caltech.
Okay. One of the things that I found fascinating when you just said something about your biases and prejudices is that when you were developing this, one of your concerns was what happens if you develop a quality, and the more you develop it, or I guess your prejudice or bias was that or fear was that if you develop it, then you might become arrogant and less open to feedback.
Right.
And you found out the exact opposite was true.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be wrong sometimes. I thought there would have to be certain elements that made a self-concept strong and other elements that would make it open to feedback, and that there would be some kind of balance between those two, and you'd have to find a really careful balance to make sure that it didn't go over into arrogance. And trying to eliminate arrogance was one of my main motivations in exploring the self, because a lot of Buddhist teachings say you shouldn't have a self. Well, that doesn't work very well. If you've ever been confused about who you are, that's no fun at all. It's like having a boat without a rudder and without a sail and without a keel. You flop around like a fish out of water. It's no fun at all. So not having a self is not really a solution. That's a baby with the bathwater solution. But I didn't like arrogance either, and so I wanted to figure out how to erase that. Now I know how to do it. Technically, I don't know how to get people to want to do it. I know exactly what to do with a narcissist to make him no longer a narcissist, but he's not at all interested in learning it. So that's the part I haven't modeled, is how to convince a narcissist that he'd have a lot more fun in life if he wasn't a narcissist.
It was interesting because I just read an article recently that they find sociopaths and narcissists, they previously had kind of been viewed in psychology as not having a choice, but they're starting to realize that they do have a choice. It's just that they keep choosing that same route, the same sort of self-importance, rather than the opposite.
Well, I'm not sure that they really have a choice. I think they're pretty fixed in their mechanics of their self-concept makes it pretty hard for them to do anything else but deny feedback that isn't complimentary.
I guess that brings up an interesting subject of desire. Maybe you can say something about that, how desire fits into the self-concept, because the article that I read about that was sort of like the option is open to them. They just don't desire to make that choice to sort of be open to feedback and less arrogant or less self-important. And that's something that I guess I hadn't thought of too much either with the self-concept model. Where does desire fit into this?
Well, desire is essentially another word for motivation. Does somebody want to do something? And, if you go to a medical doctor and he gives you some pills and you don't want to take them and you leave them in the medicine cabinet, they're not going to do any good. In the same vein, if you offer someone an NLP intervention and they really don't want it, it's not going to do any good. It's not going to work. So, a lot of NLP is convincing somebody to do what you want them to do. It's really a sales job in a lot of ways. Connie Ray many years ago worked with a Vietnam vet this was 13 years after the end of the Vietnam War. And he spent 13 years trying a whole bunch of different therapies, most of which involved exposure and going back into the horrors that he'd experienced. And it took her about a half an hour to convince him to go through the process. When she finally convinced him to try it, the process itself took only about 15 minutes. Cured his PTSD flashbacks. He had daytime hallucinations where he looked around at a flea market and everybody in the flea market was Vietnamese. And I mean, he had the whole range of PTSD symptoms. They're all knocked out in 15 minutes.
Wow.
So, but he had to be convinced to try it. Now, sometimes you can just use an as-if frame. You can just say, well, If it would work, would you have any objection? No, I don't have any objection. Well, but you're willing to waste a half an hour trying it out and really going for it to find out if it makes a difference or not. So you can sort of bracket it with an as-if frame and then go forward if the person is willing to do that. Some people aren't even willing to do that. They're just, oh, no, it's a waste of time. I've tried that before. Besides, I'm smarter than you.
Yeah. Well, what I found challenging is working sometimes with people who are depressed. And
Yes.
it's sort of like if you ask them, do you want to be happy? Do you want to be happier? A lot of times they will say, well, yes. But when you put maybe an intervention in front of them, it's just they seem to be lacking in energy and they sort of want it, but they're not very motivated. I've encountered that many times.
I think they're motivated, but they're totally convinced that that nothing will work.
Mm.
I mean, this is Seligman and his learned helplessness research kind of backs this up, that if you've given people a lot of experiences of failure, then there's a natural conclusion, no, nothing's going to work, so why try?
Mm.
So I think it's more that not so much a lack of desire as that there's a belief that blocks it. That's how I think about it anyway.
Or hopelessness.
Yeah, well, the key things in depression for a long time have been described as hopeless, helpless, and worthless.
Mm.
Now, worthless has to do with self-worth, so that has to do with self-concept. But the hopeless and helpless is more peripheral. It's more like nothing's going to work, so why try?
Mm-hmm.
Why go to extra effort and get disappointed yet one more time?
Mm.
You can think of depression as a way to avoid disappointment.
Yeah.
You don't try anything, you don't get disappointed again and again and again as you have been in the past.
And this would be a good segue to discuss self-esteem. And I'm fascinated by the recordings that I've heard of the trainings that you've done on self-concept and what I've read in the book. I don't think anyone has ever defined so well what self-esteem is, or at least what I've read about self-esteem as you have in the book and in these trainings about what self-esteem is and how to really go after self-esteem. I'm a product of growing up in the later 80s and the early 90s, where we were sort of showered with self-esteem. And the point that you make about there being no reference to it was it was like putting a key into a lock for me. It just suddenly made so much sense as to why you can try to build somebody's self-esteem and then it just withers away, like just dust blowing away or something. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think trying to build self-esteem with other esteem is even worse than that. When I worked in the oil fields during my college days in the summers, they had an expression there, pissing into the wind.
Mm.
You piss into the wind and it comes back on your body. Trying to foster self-esteem with other esteem is just, if you think about it, it's just ridiculous. Self-esteem means that you like how you think. Self-concept is who you think you are. Self-esteem is simply whether you like it or not. And that has to do with your values and what's important to you. Other esteem is what's valued and important to somebody else. They're just two different animals. They're two separate, entirely separate things. And if you can't use other esteem to build self-esteem. If someone has low self-esteem, it means that their behavior is in conflict with their values, and you can either change the behavior or you can change the values, or some of both. When they're in alignment, the person will have good self-esteem. It's as simple as that. It's ridiculously simple, and yet a lot of people, this article I just mentioned in the Psychotherapy Network, it confuses all three of those. The author of this particular article confuses self-concept with self-esteem. She confuses self-esteem with other esteem. They're just different things. If you try and foster self-esteem with other esteem, and particularly, as you said, if there's nothing, it's not tied to it, it's not, if you say to somebody, oh, you're a wonderful person, it's not tied to any particular behavior. But if you say, I really like the way you understand NLP, then there's a specific experience for you to reference. Oh, that other person thinks I'm good at that. That has a chance of affecting self-esteem, but only if it's in line with your own values.
Yeah, I can say that after reading that, and I've read the book twice, and I've listened to the recording twice, and both times got more understanding out of it. And I keep going back and referencing it. What I've done is sort of mapped out my values in certain contexts and maybe my overall general values. And I'm using that as a way to build in the qualities that I want. And what's been interesting in my own experience with this is my self-esteem has, and I wasn't even really thinking about it that much because I kind of forgot about that concept about self-esteem, but my self-esteem has increased so much. And at the same time, I'm more open to feedback, more open to, hearing what other people have to say without feeling rejected or hurt or any of these things. And I'm just using that feedback to continue to build that self-esteem and the self-concept and make it even stronger.
Yeah, well, just to clarify, what you're doing is changing your self-concept. The automatic result is self-esteem. You don't have to do anything about that.
I had completely didn't even kind of set that aside, but just noticing that self-esteem is increasing, like you're saying, just kind of on its own.
Yeah, well, there's a wider parallel to this. A lot of people want to be happy. Well, if you just want to be happy, take drugs. Shoot something into your veins, it cooks your brain, and you feel bad. You feel better. Happiness is the result of doing the things that you value and enjoy. If you do the things you value and enjoy, then happiness automatically happens. But a lot of people try and shortcut it and go straight to happiness. And, quite literally, drug abuse and food abuse and a lot of things like that is an attempt to bypass the means or the behaviors that will yield the feeling result that you want. So,
well, I just thought of this too. One of your mentors was Abraham Maslow, and he did a lot of focus on the hierarchy of values. And that was something I'd studied for a while, and I remember writing you an email saying, okay, I'm not seeing how this bridges with NLP, and I'm trying to make this connection. And that's when you referred me to your book. And without me going into explaining it, would you explain the difference between hierarchy and heterarchy?
Well, hierarchy is like a military. There's the privates and the colonels and the sergeants and the lieutenants, and I didn't even know the exact order of the generals at the top and the five-star general at the top of everything and so on. A rigid hierarchy is not good. In fact, generally speaking, rigidity is not good. If you're going to flexibly approach new problems, then any kind of rigidity doesn't work very well. Right now, hierarchy is more flexible and fluid. Right now, the most important thing for me is to talk with you. If I suddenly got a feeling in my groin that I had to pee, then that would be more important. So in actual living situations, your hierarchy of values changes from context to context. At any one moment in time, you can talk about there being a hierarchy, that this is more important than that, and so on. But across time and across context, as time changes, as context changes, your hierarchy of values will change. Now, overall, there may still be a thing of certain things are more important to you than others. But Maslow's hierarchy was a bit too rigid.
And one of the things that I encounter a lot too with coaching people, and I go through this myself, and I have a sense that this is probably related. We tend to focus a lot on having some sort of purpose in life and having a mission in life. We want to know that we have a purpose. And I think for myself, I can say I definitely go through transitions where I feel like I've sort of lost my purpose, or what I thought was my purpose isn't anymore. Is that related to the heterarchy that you're referring to? Like you have to sort of reestablish what your purpose is, and that's based on your values that have changed?
Well, I think that's a big question. It might take a long time to really explore that. I suppose it is an example of it. I think most often when people go through life changes like that, re-examining what's really important to them, I think it's most often because they made a decision early in life, and often that's influenced by culture and what you should do and what's important to do and what makes a lot of money. And at a certain point in your life, you realize that's not all that much fun, and you decide to do something that really fulfills your values rather than the values of some culture or some value that you thought was important to you as a young child. When I usually think of hierarchy, I think of just day-to-day, moment-to-moment, that things change in your importance. And you go from one task to another and so on and back and forth. And that's more what I usually think of as, but I think the kind of example you mentioned is an example. It's more of a digital thing of going from maybe abandoning a particular value and realizing that something else is more important. You can also play with values. Connie and I developed a pattern long ago, which we called criteria change, in which you think, well, what's important to you in this situation? What would be even more important to you if it changed, and so on. So you get some different criteria, such as work or family or play or something like that. And you actually get representations of those. And the representations of those will be in different places in space, different distances from you, and so on. Maybe a lower criteria will be only this long, and a larger one will be this long, and another one will be bigger and thicker, and so on. And you can actually take those and rearrange them a little bit. Once you get the different criteria and how they're arranged in space, you can use some modalities to rearrange the hierarchy. And again, the hierarchy is sort of it's a fable. It's a useful lie about what's most important to you at any given time. And that's the idea of hierarchy, is that, yeah, in a given situation, one thing will be more important to you than another. But that's going to change over context, change over time.
I like that phrase, that term that you use, useful lie. I've heard you use it in the recordings that I heard of your training, and that sometimes is not an easy thing to explain to people about their self-concept. That their self-concept itself is not really something that's real; it's a concept, and so you might as well, I guess, use it and enhance it and make it the best that it can be, because this is the way in which you respond to the world, is through this idea of who you are. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, this is true of all generalizations in science. And as you mentioned, I've got a background in hard science, so I think I can talk with at least some authority. There are all sorts of generalizations about muons and quarks and neutrinos and stuff like that, and they keep learning more and more about them. And science always learns from the exceptions. Back when I was in chemistry, the noble gases are supposed to not react with anything because their electron orbitals are all filled and so on, and so they can't react with other substances. And then some guy ran an experiment, and he wanted to have a neutral atmosphere, so he put on some xenon in there, and he did an experiment and inserted some chemicals in this, quote, neutral atmosphere, and a bunch of stuff started falling out of the air. And he analyzed it and found out it was xenon hexafluoride, which was then a brand new thing. Nobody knew that xenon, one of the noble gases, could react that way. So science is a progressive path of finding out the counterexamples. When does a generalization break down? Now, in terms of self-concept, if someone thinks they're honest, does that mean they're always honest? Well, probably not. Probably they tell a little white lie to grandma, or they don't tell the full story, let's say, so they're not really dishonest in terms of telling an actual lie, but they don't tell the full truth. Is that honesty or dishonesty? There are going to be times when honesty maybe bumps up against being sensitive to someone. That if someone's in a hospital bed and they're freaked out by something, maybe that's not the time to tell them they got a heart attack and they've got a 5% chance of survival. That would be honest, but it wouldn't be very sensitive. So there are always going to be contexts where values bump up against each other and your qualities bump up against each other, and you can't find a way to do both. And so usually one of them is more important than the other, and you do that. So either you're sensitive but you're not honest, or you're honest but not sensitive. And that means something's got to give. All our concepts are attempts to understand reality, and in that sense, they're real. They really work. I mean, if you don't think physics works, think about the atom bomb. That's a very real consequence of some very unreal ideas about how atoms react and radioactivity and chain reactions and all the rest of it. On paper, it looks very unreal, but you put it together and it has a great deal of reality when you can actually build a bomb with it. A lot of people's thinking is very digital. Is it real or is it unreal? Is it useful? Is it unuseful? And the answer to that is, well, it depends on the context, depends on the way you think about it, depends on your values and all the rest of it. In one sense, when NASA decided they wanted to send a guy to the moon, all their planning was totally unreal. They'd never done it before, but they used everything they knew about physics and propulsion systems and chemistry, propellants, and so on to back figure, well, if we're going to get a guy back from the moon, then how do we need to get him? What do we need to have with him on the moon to get back from the moon? And now that we know what he's got to have when he's on the moon, how do we figure out how to get him from here to there and all the little steps in between? That was all unreal until the guy actually walked on the moon. But it was very real in terms of the results that it got.
So I'm curious, when I'm assuming you've done a lot of this work on yourself as well, and I'm gradually.
No, I don't work on myself.
You don't?
I'm not Richard Bandler. Change everybody else, stay the same.
Well, actually, what I've done, I work on myself with the self-concept model, but I also have my business partner, Logan Christopher, who's also a really good NLPer as well. We sort of trade off coaching each other. I find it easier to work on the self-concept when you have a guide. But I'm curious about your own work on yourself. When you're talking about like there's the unreal, but then it has very real consequences. Did you think about that? Like, what kind of person do I want to be? What sort of self-concept do I want to have? And then just go in and start designing it? Or was it more along the lines of, well, I want a little bit more of this and I want a little bit more of that, and just gradually building on it?
Well, I was pretty happy with myself for the most part, but I had some flaws, just one or two. Connie Ray and I have played a lot with each other. We tend to use all the things that we develop on ourselves, and part of that's kind of automatic. Like in one of these research seminars, someone came up with the idea of future examples in the self-concept, that if you think you're honest, project honesty into the future. Imagine a future scenario and in which you're honest. And I had never thought of that. We develop our self-concept kind of ad hoc, depending on, the experiences we've had and the tutors we've had and the parents we've had and so on. It's mostly kind of an accident how we figure out how to do it. And I had never thought of having future examples. As soon as I thought about having future examples, I thought, ooh, that's a good one. So then I started installing future examples. Now, just in preparation for our little talk here, I was thinking this morning, I'm almost 80, I'll be 80 in a couple of weeks. And there are a lot of things I can't do anymore. There are things that I used to be able to do. And I checked out my database, and there's a lot of little boxes with X's in them. Well, that's something I used to do, and it was fun, but I ain't going to do that anymore. And, that's part of the feedback thing. Years ago, I was dating a young woman whose father had been an athlete, famous athlete, football star and stuff like that. Now, it had been 20 or so years before he'd done anything more athletic than raising his elbow to take a drink. But he still thought he was the athlete. He still had all those pictures of, going across the goal line and stuff like that. And his self-concept was way out of date. I don't want my self-concept to be out of date. I want it to be up and current, so that I know what I can do and what I can't do. And that way I can make promises to other people that I can usually keep.
Yeah, I've noticed that so much after working with this model, that when I come across people, or people who seem like, even people who are wearing a style that is very dated, like a style that they probably came across 20 years ago, and they're still wearing that style, I immediately think, well, that's what their database is feeding back to them. That's, where they still are in a sense. And that's why people don't update their clothing, or they don't update certain ways of being, because that feedback is constantly telling them something that is dated or no longer the case. And I find myself referring to this model just in everyday life, because I work with it so much now.
Yeah. And I want to say now, before I forget to say it, I'm really glad you're doing these trainings. I don't want to do them anymore. And you have a much better idea of how that all works than anybody else I've worked with. So I'm very pleased that you're doing these trainings, and more power to you.
I thank you, and I really appreciate that. It's a huge compliment. And I remember when you first mentioned that I should teach this, my first response, I don't know if you remember, my first response was, no, I can't teach this. And I think I was just a bit overwhelmed because this is, to me, finding this model was like rediscovering NLP all over again for the first time. Suddenly, I had plateaued quite a bit in my skills, and I was sort of begging my other mentors to help me figure out how to practice something to get better, or my NLP skills. And then it was suddenly you popped in and said, go look at this and take a see if that works for you. And it was exactly what I needed. The plateau just exploded, and my ability, I think what happened for me, and what is so important about this model to me, is that it really revealed why the NLP processes work, why the swish pattern works, why re-imprinting or change personal history works. And when it was sort of like peeling back the ceiling on it, and once I understood that, it was like, okay, now it's almost like I don't think in terms of techniques so much anymore, and I don't think in terms of processes as much. And when I'm coaching someone, I know where this is all coming from. It's coming from their self-concept. Now, I can choose whatever logical level to work on. I can work on directly on behavior. I can work on beliefs and identity. And that's what's been so extraordinary for me working with this model.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people who teach NLP do teach little processes like the swish pattern or change personal history and so on, and they're sort of isolated. And, the self-concept model, and even more than that, the expansion of that model into the Six Blind Elephants books, I think you're blending those two a little bit. But the idea of the different logical levels and the whole structure, essentially the self-concept model gives you a structure, and then you can decide what technique to use out of that structure. And it's a different way of thinking. I don't know if you've seen some of the really early concrete bridges when they were first using concrete instead of steel and timber.
I'm not sure that I have.
Well, the very early concrete bridges look like timber bridges, only they're made out of concrete, because the engineers understood about angles and triangles and stress and force and stuff like this. But they had no idea that in a concrete bridge you can make a nice smooth arch that would be far stronger than a bunch of triangles. Now you can't move it. It's very hard to make a smooth arch out of wood. You can do it, but it's very, very difficult. They just didn't understand that this new thing had different properties. This concrete had different properties, and they could do all kinds of things with it that they just couldn't do with the other. It took a whole new set of thinking to do that.
So one of the things that I find about your teaching and about your writing is that you take really complex subjects, really complex concepts. Somehow you don't reduce the complexity of them,
yes,
but you simplify it and make it very, very understandable.
Well, that's what science does. I mean, everything
That's what it does?
That's what science does.
Science, okay.
Everything in the world is made up of mass and matter and mass and energy and stuff like that. Now, this computer is a very different manifestation of mass and energy than I am, or that the bed is here, or that the lamp is, or the coconut tree outside. But by simplifying it into such things as mass and energy, it gives you a hugely important tool. Now, it's sort of a lie. Like you say, it's a gross simplification. It doesn't respect the individuality of all these different things, but it allows you to do things that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do. I mean, for instance, in standard psychiatry, there's hundreds and hundreds of names for different phobias. Well, the name for the different phobias has to do with what you're phobic of. That's totally irrelevant to the process of a phobia, which is to jump into a horrible, terrifying experience. Once you understand that structure, then you don't need to know any of the content. You can cure a phobia without finding out what horrible experience the person went through. They don't have to relate it. They don't have to have all the tears and the wailing and all the rest of it. They can just go through a process and get over it. And I hate to say that most psychology and even a little of NLP doesn't have that structural approach of, it's more procedural rather than structural, understanding the structure of what's going on, so then you can do the same kind of process with a lot of different individual instances of the process.
Yeah, when I'm explaining the self-concept model to other NLPers, actually, in some ways, I find it easier to explain the self-concept model to people who don't know NLP. It seems to make more sense to them. And people who do know NLP or they've had training, a lot of times they complicate it. And what I just have to end up telling them is it's complex and it's detailed, but it's not difficult to understand. And in fact, it's very, very simple.
Right.
And I mean, I was working, I think the easiest person I've worked with using self-concept model was a teenager, and she was she could pass any exam except a math exam.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was working with her using the self-concept model about this, because we ended up uncovering that she had a belief that she just couldn't do well at a math exam. She could do all the homework, she could do all the, she could do it all except when she went to take the exam. Working with her was so easy. Her mind was so flexible, and she could just make these changes. She would make them as soon as I would say them, and then usually with an adult, I'd have to wait and give them a few seconds. But with her, it was like that.
Yeah.
It was just instant understanding.
Well, a lot of people have a learning strategy where they try to put new learning into old bottles. So they try to take a new learning and make it into part of an old learning. This is like that. And a lot of people have trouble with getting a new structure. Piaget had a name for this. What was it? Accommodation and forget the other one. But anyway, the basic idea is that if you have an idea that's useful in a lot of different contexts, you'll tend to apply times it will work. And you say, this is like that. Oh, that tells me what to do. So it's a useful strategy. But in a new context that an old way of working with won't work with, then it just bumps up against a wall because your old way doesn't work anymore. And then you have to change the way you're working inside, the way you're thinking about something or the way you're conceptualizing something.
Well, one of the descriptions you gave of, I don't know if it was NLP as a whole, we were emailing back and forth, and it was one of those, again, those really sort of simplified descriptions that maintained all of the complexity. And it was about how we receive all information is basically coming in through whether that's our internal experience or we're receiving information outside of us. It's either coming through one representational system or multiple ones.
As the structure of meaning involves three different aspects. Meaning is how you categorize it, the complex equivalence, and also context and cause effect. Essentially, those are the three aspects of meaning. And when people come for therapy, they're basically saying, I don't like the meaning of my life. I don't like what's happening. I don't like the results that I'm getting or something like that. And it all has to do with those three elements. They're simultaneous elements. It's not like you have one without the other, but you can work with one or the other. But it's a way of greatly simplifying people's problems. It either has to do with the context or how they're categorizing experience, or how they perceive the cause and effect of the experience, or what caused the experience, or what that experience will then cause into the future.
That's really interesting. I'm glad you brought that point out. That wasn't exactly what I was referring to. Well, I guess we'll just have to move on. So last thing I wanted to do is just talk a little bit about your background in NLP, getting started in it. You're the only person I know of, and maybe you can, maybe you know other people who also worked with all three of the models for NLP, and that would be Fritz Perls, Virginia Satir, and Milton Erickson. And as far as I know, you're the only person who actually worked directly with all three of these people. Not even Bandler or Grinder met Fritz Perls. And I always find that fascinating, along with the work that you had done with Abraham Maslow. You have quite the resume, even before you got involved with NLP. Can you just give us like briefly a bit of a history of your involvement, I guess leading right up to just coming across NLP, and then what happened afterward?
Well, the resume may look better than it really is. I'm grateful for Abe Maslow for a number of things. Basically, he wanted new blood in the system, so the year that I applied to Brandeis, he required that nobody who applied have a background in psychology. So there was a mathematician, an engineer, a social worker, there was myself, a chemist, and there was another chemical engineer, and so on. And so I'm grateful for that, but he was somewhat of a disappointment. I mean, his book, Motivation and Personality, was a breath of fresh air. And in the times back in the 50s, when if you loved your mother, it was either because of, Freud said it was because of some sexual thing, and Skinner said it was just reinforcement, and it was pretty much a wasteland at that time. So Abe opened it up quite a bit, but then he didn't really go anywhere with it. He was headed in the right direction. He was trying hard, but he didn't accomplish very much. So I didn't really work with him. I studied under him. And he was a bit of a disappointment. I worked a lot with Fritz Perls, so that's for real. I spent about 10 years in Gestalt therapy from 67 to 77. I didn't spend a lot of time with Satir, and I didn't spend a lot of time with Erickson. I was only with Erickson for 1 week, and at that point in my evolution, I couldn't tell what was going on. And every once in a while, he'd pull a rabbit out of the hat, and I could say, okay, that's a nice miracle, but I don't know how it happened or how he did it. So that's perhaps overblown in terms of the influence. Now, it was long after she died that I got a hold of the Satir tapes that we put out as a series of tapes, one of which is Forgiving Parents, which is a lovely example. And so then I studied her work very carefully from the standpoint of viewing videotapes, but I didn't have that much experience of her directly when she was alive. There's some, but not a lot. Where else do we want to go with this in terms of background?
Well, I know that from conversations with Connie Ray, that Greg Brodsky was sort of your introduction. He was one who sort of introduced NLP to you.
Well, he was one of the ones. Actually, the first introduction was by Eric Marcus, who was a Gestalt therapist. There was a Gestalt therapy conference in San Francisco, East Bay, Berkeley. I think it was 77 or 78, in which he had just come back from a Bandler Grinder workshop of 5 days. And he was all enthusiastic about it and made a little off-the-cuff presentation one evening. And what really hooked us both was that it was all testable. You could say, if you ask somebody how many windows do they have in their living room, you could watch their face and watch them blink, and that's the number of blinks would be the number of windows and things like that. So then eye access and cues and anchoring and things like that. So that's what really got us hooked. And then we went to Bandler Grinder seminars, and then we had Greg come in and do some seminars. And then we just went on from there. It's been quite a roller coaster since then. It's been a lot of fun. I wouldn't do anything different, and I'm still doing the same kind of thing now. I'm still less active training. I'm not doing live trainings anymore. My voice is you can probably hear my voice is a little hoarse, and I don't think on my feet as well as I used to. But I can sit down and write just as well, because then I can go back over it and pick up the things that I've missed. And I'm a counterexampler, so I'll read what I've written and go, well, wait a minute, how about this situation? And then I have to add another paragraph to account for that. So writing is still something I can do and enjoy, but I think training is no longer for me.
Well, I hope that I can, through training, help carry on what you've created.
Yeah, I hope so too.
And speaking of writing, one of the things that I say about you and Connie Ray whenever I'm talking to maybe people who are just getting into NLP is I say that the two of you wrote the first readable books of NLP out there, because up until the books that you and she wrote are a lot of which were based on a lot of trainings, I understand, in the beginning. They were pretty much NLP books read like very technical textbooks that even though they were full of great information, to a normal person, it's just almost unreadable, and quite good for putting you to sleep at night if you're having trouble sleeping.
I agree. Good insomnia cure.
Yeah. Transformations, the first one, not the one that Bandler wrote later, to me is one of the best books on hypnosis. I say one of the best because I haven't read them all. It's certainly the best book on hypnosis that I've read.
Yeah, Connie Ray put that together.
Yeah, it was quite amazing. And I was just curious before signing off, I was just curious that, Grinder is pretty critical these days of what NLP models are happening out there. And he doesn't give a whole lot of, in fact, I haven't heard him say anything good about any other model or any other person who's created any models. And, he still refers to the meta model a lot as being one of the most clean NLP models out there. And of course, I would disagree. I think the self-concept model, in my opinion, and then of course, I haven't explored all the models, but the self-concept model is probably the most powerful and extremely clean, and follows all of the rules of modeling as far as I know them. And I was just wondering if you ever get feedback or have gotten feedback from either Grinder or Bandler on any of your work, I guess in the more recent work, the past 15 or 20 years.
No, they ignore me.
Well, what a shame. If anything, I think they would be proud.
I like to give credit where credit is due, and Bandler and Grinder and their early students opened up a whole world of exploration and to us both, and we've devoted our lives pretty much, our professional lives, to that ever since. So that would be from 77 or 78 on, I forget exactly which. But at this point, I am not learning anything from them. I learned wonderful stuff from them, including some stuff that apparently some of them have forgotten, like getting feedback. But neither of them is open to feedback.
Yeah.
I have basically nothing to do with them. And, well, their early trainings were marvelous. The trainings now, I think, are less than useful.
Well, I could talk to you all day about this, but I know you have other things to do. And I just want to say thank you again for your time. Thank you again for all the mentoring that you've done with me and introducing me to this incredible model, the self-concept model. And I got to say, it's truly humbling to be teaching this in a few weeks. And I'm going to
have fun with it. That's the first principle.
Yeah. And it is definitely a fun model to play with. I really love, and I totally am modeling what you've done in the trainings, where you're having people, whatever their model is, you have them change it anyway, just to see what it's like. Remove counterexamples, bring counterexamples back in, or move it to a different modality. And I have so much fun playing with that when I'm working with myself, or when I'm working with other people, when we're just exploring and experimenting. And just to watch them go through, just to watch their physiology when they make these changes is so much fun.
Yeah.
Because it's changing that whole self-concept, like just going from associated to disassociated, or I tend to be very sequential whenever I'm seeing images, but just spreading that out onto like a mosaic of experiences.
Yeah.
In some ways, it just changes that. It's not always clear to me exactly how it's changing my self-concept, but it's just a different quality of my self-concept. And it's just so much fun to explore that.
Well, it's a different experience. And, I think the best way to convince somebody that something's worthwhile is to have them try it out and find out what it does. And, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work. When I've done individual client work, which is not very often, I basically start out saying, I'll offer you a bunch of things to try, a lot of things to do, and actually do and change in your mind. I'm the expert on what might work. You're the expert on what does work. And what does work, might make it worse, might make it better. Well, sometimes you learn from making it worse. Oh, well, that makes it worse. I wonder if that's what I do when I get depressed. So it's all good information, and that's essentially what science is about. It's like, do something different. Science is very injunctive. Paul Václavic said long ago, There are two kinds of language. One is descriptive, like the moon is made out of green cheese, or something where you're simply describing something. But if you try and describe something like a chocolate cake, how can you describe that to someone who's never eaten a cake? You can't, but you can give them an experience of it by saying take flour and chocolate and eggs and milk and salt and mix them all together in this sequence, and you can actually give them an experience of what a chocolate cake is like. So that's one sort of a mini metaphor model of how I work with people. People have an experience they don't like. I say, well, try this recipe, find out if it works, and to what extent it works, or how is it a problem. And we'll work on the problems or the interferences or the quote resistance, the concerns or objections they might have, and we try and find a recipe for that as well.
That's an outstanding frame to work with. I hope if there are any coaches watching this that they utilize a frame like that, because, and I've even found this in myself as a coach at times, feeling this need to sort of fix someone or try to do it for them. And what I'm hearing you saying is, it's like, well, they're the experts on what works for themselves. So you're just going to give them a bunch of options, a bunch of different ways to try something until we find something that clicks.
Right. Sometimes I actually gesture like, I've got a smorgasbord of stuff to offer you. You decide what you want to eat.
Mm. That's a great frame. I love that.
Have you ever seen an actual Swedish smorgasbord?
I don't think so.
It's an enormous table. It's a huge, huge long table. I mean, 20, 30, 40 feet long. Mm-hmm. And it's got all these different foods and all these different cheeses and sauces and vegetables and all this incredible variety of stuff. And it's like a Whole Foods. What do they call that thing where you go and you pick different parts of stuff?
What comes to mind, buffet.
Yeah, like a buffet. Well, it's like the mother of all buffets. Mm. Well, so if you offer all this stuff, what do you want out of all this?
Yeah, and I guess our job as NLPers or NLP coaches is to really know each one of those pieces and know how to utilize them effectively, so that you can offer that as help or as an intervention for everyone.
That's a big part of it. Another part of it is knowing what's not worth going after. I mentioned the happiness thing, that people want to come in and I want to be happy. Well, if you want to be happy, find out what you enjoy doing and do it, and that will make you happy. But some people try to get happiness by itself. They try and get self-esteem by some magic trick or self-affirmation or something like that. It doesn't work that way. A lot of people try to get outcomes that are not under their control. They want their wife to be different. Well, that's not under your control. What's under your control? What I can do that might elicit that response in her. That's a whole different focus. And a lot of people are banging their heads against a brick wall because they don't realize the outcome specification criteria for a good outcome. What they call well-formedness criteria for a good outcome. And one of the first ones is it under your control? Is that something you can actually do? If I told you, I want you to go outside and flap your arms and fly up in the air, if you took that seriously, you'd immediately be depressed and disappointed because you couldn't do it. Well, it's not under your control. Maybe you could buy a helicopter or an airplane, but without that, to try to do that, a lot of people try to do things that just really aren't under their control. People who have been through horrible PTSD kind of experiences say, I wish it had never happened. Well, okay, I can understand that, but that's not a good outcome. Number one, it's not a good outcome because you can't do it. Number two, if you could do it, I wish I'd go back in time before it happened. If you went back in time to before it happened, then it means it would be in your future and you would be looking forward to a disaster. So that could be a disaster too.
That's interesting. I like what you said about happiness. People are wanting just happiness just for happiness. And this is something I've struggled with at times too. And what came to mind for me when you were saying that is one of my criteria for happiness is that I mean, it's sort of like the sort of happiness of well-being when you're just in the moment and you're just present. And that's not quite what I'm talking about. There's a certain quality of happiness that it's sort of like I'm earning it at the same time. I'm an active participant in my happiness. And that's one of my criteria for happiness. If I'm just kind of sitting back and waiting to be happy, it's not going to work that way.
Yeah, you got to do something. That's the injunctive language thing. You got to do something different in order to get a different response.
Yeah. Or even some of the times that I've been the most happiest was whenever I overcame a huge obstacle or overcame something that was very uncomfortable. And so it's sort of like that counterexample kind of thrown in there. You know, my happiness database, there's counterexamples of times when I wasn't happy, but those were the struggle to overcoming something. And once I overcame it, I kind of grew as a person and became a happier person.
Yeah, it looks a little different in hindsight. From the standpoint of having resolved it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, one more question. What are you most proud of in your work that you've done in NLP?
Well, first I'm going to attack the word pride. Pride is one of the 7 deadly sins. And in the old Greek mythology, it was the worst of them all. Pride is setting yourself above somebody else. It's always a comparison. And an erect penis is an example. Pride and shame are the opposites. Shame is feeling worse than everybody else. Pride is feeling better than everybody else. And the key thing is whether you sort of take responsibility or not. If you can see a baseball team and they do let's say they do a triple play or they do something really outstanding, if you can be pleased by that, I think it's wonderful. If you take pride in it, that's a mistake. That means that you had something to do with it. So pleasure is great, satisfaction is great, and a lot of people use those words interchangeably with pride. So when they say pride, they mean what are you most satisfied with? So first I'm going to change the question to be what am I most satisfied with? And what I'm most satisfied with is the 6 Blind Elephants books, which essentially takes the self-concept model and expands it to include all of experience. So it's fundamentally the same model, but it's broader. It has more wider applications. It's basically the same idea of how we generalize, how we understand the world. Basically, it's applying the ideas of science to our own thinking. And I think that's, truly as far as we've come toward it, some kind of unified field theory of psychology and how people work and how they get into trouble. And sort of the self-concept model is a subset of that, because it's restricted to the self-concept. And I think you've read the 6 Blind Elephants books too. And I think you may be blending the two, and that makes sense because they are fundamentally the same kind of process.
Well, it's interesting. I've only read 1/3 of the first volume. And yeah, I think what's happening though is, like I was saying before, is I really am seeing the world through this understanding of the self-concept model. And I'm actually understanding people, and not just when I'm coaching them, but I'm understanding people in just normal interactions.
Yeah.
How their experience is that referring through their self-concept. And I think what's probably happening is I'm coming to some of these understandings just from applying it in everyday life.
Right.
But I will tackle the books and
don't tackle them. They're not running away from you.
Sometimes it feels like it because I take on too much at one time.
I understand. Limited time.
But I would like to come back once I have read them. I'm sure I'm going to have tons of questions for you. And would like to come back and have another one of these conversations about the elephants books.
Okay. Sounds good.
All right. So you're most satisfied with the 6 Blind Elephant books, and that is because it's the closest thing, like you said, to the unified theory of psychology and how humans experience reality. And is that basically what you're most proud of?
Yeah.
Satisfied with?
Satisfied with. Pleased with.
Okay.
See, being pleased is great. Being satisfied, that's in terms of back up to self-concept. If I'm doing a particular thing and when I'm done with it, I'm pleased with it, That's my own experience. Whether anybody else is pleased with it doesn't matter. That'd be other esteem. But my self-esteem is based on my pleasure in my own actions and what I've done.
Yeah, I think some people might hear this and think that it's just semantics, or you're just being nitpicky. But it's so true that these distinctions that we make in language, even if it's language that we're not even speaking, but is going on in our minds, how much that affects us and how much that affects who we are, our self-concept and our behavior. And I remember the first time I traveled outside of the U.S., I was 17. I went to Switzerland to see a friend who had been a foreign exchange student in my school, and now I was able to go and visit him in Switzerland. And I remember this really interesting conversation we had. He said, "Are you proud to be an American?" You know, I'm 17 years old, coming from the deep South, and that, you know, is just programmed into your head, or had been programmed into my head all throughout my upbringing. And I said, "Well, you know, of course I'm proud." And he said, "Why? You were just born there. You didn't do anything for it."
Yeah.
And wow, like I just had this, right then, had this huge insight that I hadn't had before. And it really changed a lot. I remember that whole trip changed me. I was completely different when I came back, having those type of understandings, witnessing life outside of the country that I had grown up in, and being hit with a question like that: why are you even proud of something that you had nothing to do with?
Right.
Wow.
Well, what's the key thing between pride and satisfaction? If you can look at somebody and they do it, like I said, in a baseball game, they do a triple play or something that's really nice, you go, wow, that's wonderful, and you can be pleased with it. But you didn't have anything to do with it. If you use the word proud, you know, it would indicate that it's an over-identification with something that's really beyond your control and isn't it really a part of your life. That's what a lot of people do with sports. They get proud of their own team. And then they get very dejected when they lose.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that, you know, you hear about these fights, and they had one guy from this area at a Dodgers game that got beat up so severely that he still hasn't recovered, and that was like 2 or 3 years ago. And it was over the teams. He was wearing the jersey of the opposing team, the Giants.
Yeah.
And that's, I guess that's part of the danger of pride. That's what happens.
Well, anytime you make yourself better than somebody else, it means you're more deserving and that you're a human being and they're not. And you can beat them up or enslave them or screw them over or whatever. Mm-hmm. So that's the whole comparison thing, which is a whole nother topic. We could spend an hour on comparison. And, you know, it's wonderful to compare yourself with somebody else if your goal is to say, well, how could I do that? That person does something that I would really like to be able to do. How can I compare what I do with what they do so that I can learn? That's wonderful. That's what little kids do all the time. You know, they grow up and they want to be like daddy or mommy or the guy next door or something like that. That's a useful use of comparison. But the whole status thing is really a horrible thing. And it seems to be pretty hardwired. You know, chickens have pecking order and baboons have hierarchies and stuff like that. It's actually a hierarchy, but something of a hierarchy. There's sort of an alpha male. You know, so it's important, and it's important to know where you stand in a given group, especially if it's a hierarchy. But to base your idea of who you are on it is giving up your sense of self to somebody else's views and somebody else's opinions, and that's just not useful. Building a strong self-concept is something that should carry you through difficult times or insults, like I mentioned, the gal with the mustache. You're very beautiful. Don't ever shave your mustache. I love that. I wrote a 3,000-word article about it. Okay, maybe that's enough for today.
Yeah, I think the birds are telling us it's time to go.
Something. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out to do this, and I really appreciate all that you've helped me with. And part of my mission is to share this model with people, and hopefully they can have a lot of the same benefits that I've gotten from it, and I continue to get from it. And so thank you for the work that you've done and all the help that you've given me and the time to sit down and talk about it.
Well, you're quite welcome, and it's wonderful for me to have somebody like you who really understands it and is willing to get out there and do it. Gratitude blesses both the great giver and the receiver.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's no upper limit to gratitude. And there's no threshold beyond which it's a problem, beyond which it becomes a problem. So gratitude is not like pride. It's just an overflowing. So thank you too.
And gratitude was the first quality that I had a major transformation working on using the model. That's what I had first written you about.
Yeah.
That was an incredible experience to use that as a quality and really enhance it. And there was so much understanding that came through from that. And then at that point, I was completely sold on the model.
Well, that's maybe one more thing. To contrast pride with gratitude. Pride is, I deserve this. Gratitude is, I didn't deserve this, but I got it.
And that feels so much better.
So much better. Yeah. So gratitude is a nice antidote to pride.
Absolutely.
Pride is a drag. And you have to keep upholding your self-image to other people, and you have to be oversensitive to any dissing. You know, somebody disses you or criticizes you, then you have to flash back and maintain your status in the pecking order and all that stuff. What a drag.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, enough for today.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Have a great day, and we'll be in touch soon.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.